Started. Welcome to the Civility Project. I'd love for Pete to introduce the City of Novi's perspective, and then we're going to do a little video from our sponsor, and then we'll explain how this evening will go. So welcome, everybody.
Thank you, Lynn. For those that don't know, I'm Pete Auger. I'm the city manager of Novi. And we actually had Lynn, Stephen, and Nolan do this session for an employee group, and it was so successful and got a lot of good conversations going. Didn't solve all the world's problems in the 90 minutes we spent together, but pretty close. But it did start some interesting conversations after the fact. So hopefully you'll find this enjoyable as well. Open your minds, open your hearts, and just enjoy the ride and make sure you participate, because the old saying goes, you get what you put into it. So thanks again, Nolan, Stephen, and Lynn for doing this. It's all yours.
Well, we're glad to.
So I'm going to start by just sharing a quick little video from our sponsor. Delta Dental is really generous in making this free to anybody who wants to host or attend. And so we just want to shout out to them as a thank you. We'll watch this brief video and then we'll jump into the program.
We are living in challenging times. Politics is polarizing. Racism is rampant. The pandemic is frightening, and families are divided. Tough times require more dialogue and more understanding. But navigating our differences constructively is hard work. Delta Dental believes that healthy, smart, vibrant communities are also civil and harmonious. They are places where disagreement does not have to be toxic or destructive. Civility starts with listening. Welcome to the Civility Project. We are living in challenge.
All right, so welcome everybody. This is the Civility Project, and what we aim to do is to have a little conversation about what we mean by civility and how we can make it happen in our relationships, our workplaces, our communities. And so Stephen and Nolan are probably journalists that you read all the time, and they will introduce how this project came to be and what we're trying to do here, and then we'll have an opportunity to go into a breakout session and have some smaller group conversations, and then we'll come back together. And the whole time, if you have questions, put them in the chat, or just raise your hand, because we're a small group and we can probably just call on you and have a nice dialogue. So Stephen and Nolan, I'd love for you to take it over and talk about exactly what the Civility Project is and how it came to be.
Nolan, you want to start, or you want me to?
Why don't you, Steve?
Okay, so the Civility Project, I think, is probably easiest understood as an effort by Nolan and by me to share some of the things that we've learned over the last 13 years, almost 14 years of us working together, but also developing a pretty important friendship across great political and social differences. When I came back to Detroit from Washington in 2007 to help lead the editorial page at the Detroit Free Press, Nolan was, as he is now, the editorial page editor at the Detroit News, and those two papers, of course, have long sat on opposite sides of the political spectrum. The Free Press is the liberal paper, the News is the conservative paper in town, and so Nolan and I got to know each other because people would invite us both to come argue with each other in front of their television cameras or their radio microphones or live gatherings, and you know, we were good at that, and we're still good at that. We have really deep and fundamental differences when it comes to politics and ideology, you know, if you put any issue really in front of us, we can really go at it. But we also discovered over time that we liked each other, that we had some things in common, and that our political differences didn't define the relationship, just as our politics and our ideologies don't define us. So we started, really, we really started to grow beyond just the back and forth. And over time, if you think about what's happened over the last 13 or 14 years, we noticed that kind of interaction was becoming rarer and rarer. The ability or the willingness even of people to make relationships across the political divide or to maintain them as division became sort of the spine of our politics, just kind of went away, and things deteriorated to the point where lots of people can't talk to family members anymore because of the political differences. People have lost friends, colleagues, that kind of thing. And so we started the Civility Project as a way of trying to identify those things that have allowed us to maintain that relationship over that time, and to share that with other people, to share that with other groups, to say, well, maybe if you tried it this way, maybe if you tried some of the things that worked for us, you would have the same kind of opportunity. We started this a few years ago with parties, bourbon parties, really, because bourbon was one of the first things that Nolan and I discovered we had in common. We both really liked it, and so we started there. We said, look, what if we threw parties, bourbon parties, where we invited the people that Nolan knows, the conservative people that he knows in town, and invited the more liberal people that I know, and got them together to be able to talk about something other than their differences, to be able to find something in common. And it grew from there as things got really much worse in the political dialogue in the country. The 2016 election, of course, really plunged things to new lows. And then, as if we didn't imagine things could get worse, they did over the next 4 years. And so we decided that we needed to do it in a more formal way, and ask groups like yours to hear us out about why this is valuable, and how it's possible, how it's not as out of reach as it often seems. It's something that all of us have the capacity to do.
Yeah, and I would say that this kind of grew out of this, as in the early days, as Steve talked about it, when people would see us out together, sitting at a bar or some event, and engaged in a conversation, a non-political conversation, and getting along. We'd always get that comment, "Oh wow, it's you two. How can that be? That's strange, bedfellows." Although there was never any bed involved. It was curious to people, and we thought, why is this such a curiosity? Why is it such an anomaly? I mean, we all live the same place. We're all Americans. We might think differently and believe differently, but it's not like any of us are so apart and so opposite and so different. There's common ground, among us that we ought to be able to build off. And we were together on Mackinac Island once for a Republican state convention, and Steve and I were having a drink, and I walked away. Two women came rushing up and said, "God, how could you be friends with him? He's so awful." And I said, "Well, and they said, we hate them." And that's what stuck with me. We hate him. And I said, "Well, how on earth do you know you hate him? Have you ever met him?" "No." "Have you ever talked to him?" "No." I said, "Well, do me a favor, go over there and talk to him a few minutes. He's, alone, and, I know he'll talk to you. And they came over there and they had a very long and what seemed to be a very pleasant conversation. They came back to me and said, oh, we just love him. And it occurred, to us then, occurred to me then that we make a lot of assumptions about people who we don't really know. And we make those assumptions based on their politics. And we assign very negative, sinister attributes to those people based on what they believe and based on their politics. And that's not who we are. At least it's not all we are. And if you could push through that, you can find yourself having productive friendships and productive conversations with people who you would have thought, no, I could never talk to that person, or I just hate that person. So we're trying to take a little hate out of all of this because there's way too much of it. And there's more all the time when we look at people or read people or hear people talk and say, oh, I hate them. No, you disagree with them. And you don't have to hate them because you disagree with them. And you can find some benefit in getting to know them, conversing with them, building relationships. And you can enrich yourself in the process. And so that's sort of the goal of this, to get people talking and to get people to stop hating.
Yeah, so thanks for that intro. I think in a few minutes we'll go into a breakout session, but before we do, I wonder if you guys could offer some tips for how people can actually put this to work in their own relationships. So there are, 2 or 3 things to keep in mind to make this actually easy to do, and then we can try it out in a breakout session.
Well, the one step that's essential, and it's when we started doing these exercises with the Detroit Regional Chamber in the beginning, we put people of different backgrounds, different opinions, different politics, different races together one-on-one and asked them to talk about anything but politics, to talk about who they are as people, what experiences and values that they hold that inform their political views, what makes them who they are, what makes them a Democrat, what makes them a Republican, a liberal, a conservative. It's an exercise that Steve and I went through ourselves a few years ago. And the idea of it, the goal of it is that you understand people better and you understand the very genuine reasons they may have for feeling the way they do. And, our belief is that most people come to their opinions the same way. They take the information they have, the facts, and apply their own experiences and values to them and come up with an opinion. And if they come up with some opinion different than you, it doesn't make them evil. And, I think that's the very, very first step, is to go through that process and build a respect for people and for the reasons they think the way they do. You might not accept those opinions still, but at least you have some understanding of where they're coming from.
Yeah. For Nolan and I, there was kind of a pivotal moment where I think both of us experienced that in this interaction. The NPR project called StoryCorps came to Detroit a few years ago, and StoryCorps is an effort to record Americans in discussion about their relationships with the people close to them, about why those relationships work, about the challenges in those relationships, and why those relationships matter to them. Normally they're capturing people with family members or with spouses. When they came to Detroit, I said, well, I'm going to take Nolan down there with me, and we're going to sit there for an hour and talk about the interaction between the two of us. And I said, I didn't want us to talk about the things that we normally talk about, politics and ideology and the things that divided us. I wanted us to go and just talk to each other about where we get the ideas that we have. Like, what is the set of experiences that leads Nolan Finley to be a conservative? Why does he see things that way? What were the things that happened in his life that led him to believe that that's the right way to solve problems, and that I would do the same. I would talk about what made me into a liberal or a progressive or whatever label you want to put onto it. And we sat there for an hour and had that conversation, and we learned a lot, I think, about each other that we didn't know. I mean, by this point, we'd already been friends for about a decade, but there was stuff that we didn't know that came out in that conversation about the other. But it did give us that deeper appreciation too of, well, now I see why you come at this issue this way, or when you do come up with this kind of opinion, I have a context for it. I know more about what your motivation is. I know more about why you're likely to see that as an appealing approach. And that really was kind of a kickstart to the idea of this project, was if we could do that after 10 years of interacting with each other and still get something out of it. Imagine what the possibilities would be for people who are not talking to each other and not working together. That fundamental kind of baseline understanding of who somebody is beyond their politics is an enormously beneficial part of trying to figure out how to have a civil exchange.
And Lynn, if I may then go to the second step, after you've done that exercise and after you've built a level of respect and after you feel you've reached that point of trust and understanding where you can take the fear out of the exchange, where you can be yourself and be honest about the things you feel and why you feel them. I think then you have to set an honest goal for the conversation you want to have. I mean, once you decide you want to have the conversation, you have to set an honest goal. And if your goal is, if you approach it as a zealot, if you think, my goodness, I'm not going to sleep tonight unless I bring that person around to my way of thinking, unless I cure and fix that person, that's going nowhere. That kind of conversation is going nowhere. And a conversation is not a competition. You're not out there to win. If your goal is to score points, to prove yourself smarter than the other person, to embarrass the other person, don't bother. It's just going to lead to even more hard feelings. But if you set the honest goal that I want to have this conversation because I want to reach a greater understanding of the other person, I think there's something I might be able to learn, even if my views don't change, in listening to the other person's views. Or I simply want to check my own arguments and my own positions and reassess the things that I believe. Those are all good goals and those are all productive goals. But make sure you're entering the conversation with those honest, productive goals.
I think that's such a great point because I think even myself, I've been doing this with you guys now for over a year, and sometimes I don't even know why I believe what I believe. I think it's a great exercise to enter into, just to ask ourselves, how did I get here? And so let's do that, you guys. Let's do some breakout rooms. I think we'll have 3 to 4 people in a room, and we'll take about 10 minutes. And the question that would be great to look at is, how do you come to your beliefs? So what experiences or values or family teachings have led you to your political standing? So give it a little thought while I put you guys into rooms, and I'll broadcast the question when we get there. And you'll have about a 1-minute warning when they're about to close, and then we will come back and see how it went. All right, ready? Here we go.
I can't multitask now. I've got my video on.
Welcome back. Welcome back, everyone. Everybody just appears from the ether, right? All right, so let's get everybody back in the room. They're almost all here.
you want to come back, Lynn, to sort of an open discussion, or are there some more questions you wanted to ask?
Yeah,
Just
I
let
think it
people
would be
talk
great
to
to,
us and ask us questions. The
yeah, I think,
benefit of a small group, lets us do perhaps more of that than we normally would get to.
absolutely. I think we have everyone back. Yeah, so what we'd love to do is ask you how it went. Was there anything surprising or revelatory in the groups? Any discoveries? And we can just jump in. We're a small group. We can make this a dialogue. So I'd love to hear from anybody who wants to share what happened in their group or what they noticed.
All right, I'll say something about our group. I think the thing that surprised me was that the three of us seemed all to be kind of in the middle of the road. No strong pull one way or the other, but maybe that's age and maturity and exposure. But we really didn't have anybody that was, like super conservative. Their background may have been, but they've adjusted and grown from that, or the opposite, super liberal.
Anna, could I ask you a question? I mean, as middle of the roaders, do you ever get a sense or feeling that you're being left behind, unrepresentative, that nobody really speaks for you?
Yeah, I definitely have problems at the polls because there isn't that option. So what I end up, and we talked about that a little bit, end up splitting my ticket because I vote for people. Obviously, you can't do that in the primaries, but when we get down to the end of it, I end up voting for people rather than for a political movement, if you will. And it'd be nice to have something that was more representative of how I feel. That wasn't so strong one way or the other.
It's a really good point. I'm the mom of 4 teens. One is old enough to vote, one is almost there, and they have very strong opinions and very extreme to one end opinions. And this is all they know is this big divide. And they've been talking, especially over the last year, about how we need a third party, we need more options. And my mom, who's obviously older than me, will say to them, well, it wasn't always like this. But I feel like younger voters, this is what they think it is. It's one extreme or another, as opposed to middle of the road.
I agree with you. I have 2 teenagers as well, and that's exactly their sentiment.
Could I ask a question? I'm sorry to interrupt, William. How do you define middle of the road? Because I think I probably have a different definition of what middle of the road means compared to maybe what your group did.
Good question. Thank you.
Somebody else want to jump in, or?
Feel free. You're on a roll. Let's hear from you.
Well, all right. For me, it is some conservative values from an economical perspective, I would say. I definitely am not one that is big on huge social programs. I want to help people that need help, but I want them to be able to find a way I want that to be self-sufficient over time. So something that isn't just, huge programs of support, but more of education and support for a temporary period of time where you have to, earn your way if you're capable of earning your way. And yet, on the other hand, I believe in social programs. I want, people to have the support that they need. So from a financial perspective, it isn't, purely Democratic or Republican. It's somewhere in between. From a social perspective, I would say I'm a lot more liberal. So I don't have a strong conservative approach for people. Everybody to me is the same. I'm trying to define it. I hadn't really thought about how to define that, but there's, I guess, 2 aspects of it.
Thank you so much for being brave enough to share that. It can be a little scary to say in front of a crowd, like, hey, this is.
Yeah, I haven't really formed my thoughts very well, but I was trying to grasp at some of the things that make me feel like neither party really represents what I'm looking for. There's aspects to both that I like.
Interesting. I don't know, Nolan and Stephen, if you want to chime in on this, but I've been reading a lot about this current bill that is, that the Biden administration proposed, and there's research that 70 to 80% of Americans support it, but there's strict party line divisions in Congress. And as a citizen, I find it hard to grapple with that. So I don't know if you guys have anything to say about it or any way to chime in.
Well, I mean, I was interested in hearing, the answer to that question because, I think most people live closer to the middle than our policymakers do. And the way our politics have evolved in recent decades is, we've allowed the extremes to have the biggest voice in both parties. And we've allowed them to pull our political leaders away from the middle and to the extremes. And there's a great fear among our political class to compromise, to build consensus, to explore collaborative solutions. Not all. I think there's some very good people who are working hard to work together, but that comes with a price. You're punished in the political world today for working together and for compromising. And I think it's up to us as voters to change that. I think we've got to start rewarding rather than punishing the people who are willing to work in the middle, because I think that is where most of us live.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there are a couple things wrong with the system right now that encourage the kind of behavior you're talking about, the overly partisan, the kind of fealty to ideology or party over practicality, and some of them are dynamics that have been in our form of government almost from the beginning, from the beginning of parties, which starts right after George Washington leaves office, really. But some of it is about features that we could do something about. The control that parties have over the election process itself encourages this kind of extreme iteration of representation. The way that we draw congressional districts and legislative districts, leaving it up to parties. And you can go to any state you want and see the same thing on either side, right? When Republicans have control of that process, they do the same thing that Democrats do when they have control of that process. Well, if you let the parties draw the lines, they're going to draw them in a way that favor them, favor the party, and favor re-electing members of the party. And at times when you have very vocal and very strong groups on the fringes, kind of pulling at those parties, you make it really hard for people who sit closer to the middle to compete. The fear that everybody in Congress has right now is not of the other party. It's of their own party. It's that if they vote in a way that angers the quote unquote base of the party, they'll lose their jobs, they'll lose their seats. It's not supposed to work like that. I mean, it's a system that's designed to have competition across the middle. And we have almost none of that. I mean, there are very few seats each time we vote that are competitive, that are within reach for each party. We got to change that. I also think the influence of money in the process and the unbridled influence of money helps cement the parties in these extremes. The people who give money and the people who take money are far more invested in the system than most people are. I mean, most people don't spend their whole lives thinking about politics and ideology and policy and things like that. The people who do now have complete control of the system, so that those of us who are just trying to get something done or want government to work in a certain way don't have much of a voice. Money is a driver of that. And so there are things we can do to try to change those things. The question is whether the rest of us will step up and do it. And that's been the big problem.
Thanks, you guys. Who else can share from their group about how the conversation went or anything that you realized in the process?
Yeah, our group. Go ahead, Tia.
Go ahead. Well, no, I was actually just going to say something about the gentleman who was just talking, but
Yeah.
we'll go
Okay,
into the
yeah.
group. That's fine. I'll come
No,
back to it.
let's hear from you. It's great.
Oh, well, I was curious to find out or to just hear a little bit about what do you think in terms of the who is in power and what it is they are wanting to maintain. For example, Caucasian men only make up 31% of the population in the United States, but they make up over 65% of those holding elected office. And so there is an ideology that I do believe is being maintained, possibly by both parties, very likely by both parties. So can you speak a little bit about that and what, because I hear us talking like what the problem sort of is, but not why we have that problem. And that I think we possibly have had that problem all along since we started having political parties. And I'm also curious, I heard earlier, I think Mr. Nolan said it, which was that that we've evolved into this kind of party. And I'm just curious, when were we a different kind of political setting and who experienced that other setting?
Well, I actually remember a time when within these two parties, there was diversity of opinion. I knew conservative Democrats and I knew liberal Republicans in my younger days in this job and on this beat. It's not that way anymore. You've got to swear allegiance to a certain ideology before you can join now or survive in either of these parties. Now, I am to the point where I believe this two-party system as it exists today will be impossible to restore civility because they are rewarded, motivated, and profit from keeping us divided. And I'm willing to consider radical reforms to break the franchise of these two parties and their influence over our politics and over our over our democracy. Some ideas, I've been kicking around and discussing with people. Well, for one, I do believe this national popular vote movement would have spared us, hopefully would have spared us for what we went through in this last election, because it wasn't a close election. It was a 7 million vote popular election difference. I don't think we would have seen the challenges in places like Michigan and Pennsylvania and Georgia and elsewhere because the popular vote was so large. And I think it would force candidates to campaign everywhere and to bring a more universal message. I also would strip party designations off the ballot. Would put names on the ballot. If you want to run as a Republican, you can campaign as a Republican or a Democrat. Parties can raise money on your behalf, but when you go onto the ballot, you go just as your name. And I'd also explore this idea of ranked preference voting, which breaks the two-party hold on the system and could work out very well. I think it's time to try something different because what we're doing isn't working.
Stephen?
Yeah, your question about diversity is an important one. As you point out, white people are an increasingly smaller percent of the population in this country, and in just a few years, this will be a truly pluralistic society when there is no one demographic group that is a majority. And we're not seeing politics reflect that at the rate that it's changing in the population. The reasons for that, of course, are the historic inequalities that have been with us since the beginning. I mean, there are barriers that were erected that still have an effect on people's ability to participate fully in the system. But I would also really point out that trend lines in terms of where we're headed really do suggest that we're going to have a much more pluralistic kind of representation much faster over the next 10 or 20 years. 2017 saw a record number of non-white people run for Congress, saw a record number of women, 2018, saw a record number of women run for Congress. We have the most women in Congress right now that we've ever had as a nation. We've got African Americans plural in the Senate. How hard has it been to break that barrier? So I mean, things are moving, and they're moving slower than I would like to see them move, and slower than they probably should. But they are headed that direction. It's just really hard to overcome barriers that again were baked into the beginning of the country. I mean, these are things that have been with us since the jump, and we're just now in many cases smashing through them. So
Thanks, you guys. And thanks, Tia, for asking that. I know somebody else was waiting to chime in about their group, and I couldn't see who it was. So who is that person?
That was me. Yeah, I found it interesting that the other group mentioned that all three of them sort of came across as not strongly aligned either way, because that was sort of the conclusion in our group too, which sort of surprised me that there would be that many people that didn't fall strongly one way or the other. But maybe that's why we signed up for a class on civility.
Good point, William. That's a great point. Yeah.
I do think it's telling that on how we moved from the American mainstream, if you will. These two parties have become. They've lost their appeal, and they've lost their hold on Americans. There are now more people identify as independents than identify as Republican or Democrat. Independent is the largest of voters today.
Yeah. Would anybody else, we have just a few minutes left, so I'd love to hear if there are any other insights from your breakout session or anything else about those discussions before we move on to another topic. Julie?
I think one of the other things I would add is that how education had a part in changing, where someone might have come maybe in their younger years, and I'll be that example, where when I had the opportunity to go away and experience education and open my eyes and ears and world to so much more, and to be and to experience so much more, that it allowed for newer opinions and to, fresher eyes for the things that I was seeing about the world, and continuing that education and wanting more of it, and that I think a lot of us here in this group, I don't want to say for sure, but I think we are interested in learning still, wanting to be reading and putting ourselves out there to be learning of others.
Awesome, thank you, Julie.
But Julie wasn't part of that at MSU, so that doesn't really count, right?
Now, Pete.
I don't know. Our whole group was MSU.
Our whole group was Spartans. We loved each other.
That explains a lot.
Oh boy, oh boy. Well, Stephen and I met at Michigan, but we won't hold it over you. So, anybody else want to chime in about their group or anything that they wanted to add to the conversation? Well, I think what would be nice to close on would be a little bit of focus on active listening, which is one of the key tenets of civility building that we talk about in a lot of these sessions. So Stephen and Nolan, I wonder if you could finish us off by just sort of talking about the role that active listening plays in this pursuit of civility.
Well, Steve is much more articulate on that subject, so why don't we let him take that?
Okay, sure. So, listening is one of the kind of bedrock, I guess, principles that we talk about when we talk about civility. The ability to actually hear what the person you're talking to is saying, and we use that word a little differently, I think, than most of us do in our sort of normal lives. I think we think that if we're not talking, we must be listening. If I'm letting somebody else talk, that means I'm listening to them. And I think when we use that word, we mean something a little more than that, because a lot of times we're not talking, but we're also still in our own heads about what we think. We're still trying to kind of plot out what we're going to say as soon as that other person stops talking, or maybe we're judging what they're saying, in our minds while they're talking. When we talk about active listening, we really mean the idea of quieting yourself in your own head and engaging with what the other person is saying, really trying to not just hear them, but understand and maybe think about why they're saying what they're saying. What is it about this subject or this issue that leads them to this conclusion? And I'm as guilty of this as anybody else is. You find yourself not doing it, but I kind of have a couple of tests for myself about when I'm actually listening. One is when the person is done talking, could I repeat back to them what they said? I mean, not word for word, but really capture the essence of what they were trying to communicate when they were talking. The other is, do I actually have questions about what they said? Am I interested in knowing more or understanding better what it was they were saying? And when those two things are true, I kind of know I actually was listening, and I am curious about hearing more. If I can't do either of those things, then I know I failed the active listening test, and I think we all do. I think we all do. Sometimes it's kind of human nature.
Stephen, I will tell you that since we started doing these sessions, whenever I have an issue with my teens, I try to tell them about active listening. It's not really working yet. I'll work on that too.
Yeah, I think there's an age limit. Maybe 24.
Teenager.
Yeah. Nolan, did you want to add on anything to that?
As we close, I would just like to say that, I believe we are in a very dangerous place in our country, in our world. This all-out push by our two political parties to destroy one another, when one gains power, to try to wipe the other one away, to silence each other. This is not healthy. This leads to a very, very bad place. And as I mentioned in the beginning, the hatred that is building amongst us is not good for our society. It's not going to be good for our children, and it will keep us from being as good as we could be. And it'll keep us from realizing the sort of society, the sort of country, the sort of world we'd all like to see, whether we're conservative or progressive. I mean, we all want a good place for our children to grow up and live. We all want prosperity. We all want people to have an equal opportunity. Those are goals that are within our reach and things we can do if we can stop hating and learn to work together and learn to find a middle. And there's nothing wrong with standing in the middle.
So much. Nolan and Stephen, thank you as always for leading us in this, and to the city of Novi, thank you very much for hosting this, and everybody for showing up. It was really nice to be with you tonight.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
You too.
You too.